USA history guy here. Today we're talking about Reconstruction. Now, in order to understand what was going on politically, here's a simple way to remember the Republicans. Their party was split between moderates, like President Lincoln and eventual President Andrew Johnson, and the radical Republicans. Before Lincoln's death, he seemed to be moving in the direction of working more with the radical Republicans. He was a politician, and he knew how to get things done. But we'll never know where Lincoln would have ultimately ended up in his philosophy of Reconstruction because John Wilkes Booth killed him. So that made Andrew Johnson the president. Andrew Johnson was an interesting vice president for Abraham Lincoln. He was a Democrat from Tennessee. And if Lincoln was lenient to begin with in some people's eyes, President Andrew Johnson was even more so. By the time Andrew Johnson assumed office, he had a couple of very different opinions than his Republican Party did, particularly the radical Republicans. Andrew Johnson felt that most of the southern states could be admitted already. They didn't even have to do anything more than maybe that little 10% oath. But the overall philosophical difference was who would even be in charge of leading Reconstruction. Andrew Johnson thought it should be the president or the executive branch. And the Republicans in Congress said, dude, we're the legislature, we're gonna take control here, thanks for playing. Well, the trouble really heated up when those radical Republicans began presenting their legislation in order to bring changes to the South. Questions over what would happen to the Confederate leaders, what would happen in the future of freed men and women. The problem with Andrew Johnson is that when he had a chance to jump on the initial civil rights movement in America of the 1860s, as president, he continually vetoed legislation designed to take care of that purpose. Andrew Johnson continually vetoed legislation that would have helped bring more equality to America. For a long time, Johnson had some allies in Congress, most of the moderate Republicans, but he was so staunchly against change that he really forced those moderates into the arms of the radical Republicans in Congress. And Johnson soon found himself really a man without a country, or at least a president without a party. And ultimately, the 14th Amendment would be a major showdown. And the 14th Amendment didn't exist until Andrew Johnson forced Congress to create it. He was vetoing their legislation, and as Congress, they could override his veto, which they continually did. It's never a good sign for a president when he's being overridden by Congress repeatedly. As a matter of fact, Johnson was so staunchly against the Congress by this point, he told the southern states to not even ratify the 14th Amendment, which provided privileges and immunities for all of the people based on natural-born citizenship. Ironically, the first state that quickly did ratify the 14th Amendment in the face of Johnson's order or suggestion was Tennessee, his very own state. When Tennessee ratified the 14th Amendment, one of Johnson's rivals said, "Send my respects to that dead dog in the White House." And that really did foreshadow problems for the president. Andrew Johnson was like, "Who are you calling a dead dog?" Finally, as Andrew Johnson continued to alienate just about everybody around him, it became clear that Congress was going to take control of the Reconstruction process. Beginning in March of 1867, Congress passed the first Reconstruction Act. They took control of the South, turning it into basically a also known as militarily occupied zone. And the South was turned into districts overseen by the military, all under the eventual leadership of the Secretary of War, a man named Edwin Stanton, who is a very important character in this saga. Each time the South would take steps to block one of the Reconstruction Acts, Congress would just take another step and pass another Reconstruction Act. So that eventually, after 4 of these types of bills, they had instituted control and change that they intended to see. Look, it's the Lincoln dog.